As a part of the outreach ministry of the First Baptist Church in Shreveport, Louisiana, we are pleased to present our pastor, William E. Hull, speaking from the church's pulpit.
Martin Luther. He was born on November 10, 1483, and you can believe that the Lutherans and almost all the Protestants are going to make quite a thing out of that 500th year when it comes this fall. In fact, even now there's a major governmental dispute because the postmaster has approved a postage stamp with Martin Luther on it, and some of the people that either are against religion or are for freedom of all religions are protesting, so we're already arguing over whether to lick the back of his face and stick it on a letter. By most people, Martin Luther is viewed, with the exception of the Apostle Paul and Augustine, as the most important Christian since Christ. He was a giant of German culture. He was the founder of what we call Protestantism. He was the catalyst of what we call the Reformation. And he obviously was the namesake of the denomination that bears his name, the Lutheran Church, which is, of course, the great Protestant church of Europe and is one of the 3 or 4 most powerful churches, Protestant churches in America. It is very difficult to talk about Luther because he is the most colorful and the most quotable of all of the people we will ever deal with. I have brought a standard biography of Luther by Roland Bainton. And by the way, some of you have said, I'm so interested in some of these people, I want to read up on them. So I have prepared a brief list of biographies on all 8 of the people we're treating this spring. And as soon as we can find space, that will be printed in the Chimes. And we're asking the library to get copies of all that are in print so that even you won't have to buy them. Just check them out there or get your own copy. Well, Bainton has written a wonderful book on Luther, and to try to save time and yet give you the flavor of this remarkable, incredible man, I'm going to quote a little more from his life using these sources than I normally would. Luther, as I said, was born in 1483, and all of these towns that we're going to name, the so-called Luther country, is in what we now call Eastern Germany. So if you have to go behind the Iron Curtain, he actually was born in a town called Eisleben, over in the Thuringia region of Germany, of very strict parents who were working people. His father had been a peasant on the farm, but was driven to work in the mines and eventually achieved moderate, what we would call for then, middle-class success. There was a lot of Catholicism. Everybody was Catholic then. The Catholic Church was one with the Holy Roman Empire, the state. These people had a lot of superstition. They had a lot of earthy Catholic pietism. They were very strict. They caned Luther, he said, until they drew the blood, disciplining him. They were religious, but not too much. When he entered the priesthood, they resented the fact that he would not become a jurist, a lawyer, who would support them in fine fashion in their old age. Martin was brilliant. He went to the best schools of that area, ending up at the University of Erfurt, where he received the Master of Arts degree in 1505. Now, right at that point, when he was about 18 years old, when he was well-trained, when he had an attractive career in law or public service in front of him, he nevertheless brought to a climax a deep-seated discontent that was religiously motivated. This led to the first of several crises from approximately 1505 up to about 1513 or 14. In July 1505, trudging over a parched road, a young man, short and sturdy in the dress of a university student, approached a village. The sky became overcast. Suddenly there was lightning. A crashing storm, a bolt of lightning, knocked the man to the ground. Struggling, he arose in terror and cried, "Saint Anne, help me, I become a monk." This was against his will. Saint Anne, by the way, was the patron saint of miners, And so this was his father's saint protector. He did this nevertheless, feeling that it would resolve the deep turmoil within his soul. He had always been taught that monks receive the greatest rewards in heaven. He'd always been taught they were the most respected on earth. And so he sought out the most difficult order, which was the Reformed Augustinian order, and he entered it and went through a terrible regimen of discipline. Thought I'd give you a little idea of what that was like. His first year as a novice began when he was awakened daily for prayer between 1 and 2 in the morning. This was by the ringing of the cloister bell. As soon as it was heard, each monk was to spring up, make the sign of the cross, pull on the white robe, without which he never left his cell. Then a second bell called them into the church. They sprinkled themselves with holy water. They knelt before the high altar. They prayed. They took their places for a service lasting 3/4 of an hour. Now they did that 7 times a day, plus, of course, study and the like. So this was an incredibly rigid, demanding, total immersion in the life of medieval Catholicism. This, however, did not bring him peace. And so after trying all that the Augustinian monastery offered, he made his favorite trip to Rome. There, everybody was encouraged to climb the, 28 steps leading up to the Church of the Lateran, many of them praying to the Father on each of the steps. Luther did that. He even kissed each one of the steps, making these heroic efforts to find peace in his soul. Instead, he had another crisis. He was repulsed by the laxity of the Italian clergy. When he finally got to the top and kissed every one of them, saying, Our Father, a Lord's Prayer at each level, the story has it that when he reached the top, he said to himself, who knows whether this is so or not? Now, the reason I say that is that when Luther revolted against the church of his day, he did not revolt against something he didn't understand or hadn't tried. He revolted against something that he had nearly killed himself, starved himself, disciplined himself. Very often he fasted, he took cold showers and went without any top clothing and the like. He did everything possible, and it was all to no avail. But then he transferred over to Wittenberg, where he was to live the rest of his life in 1511, which was very interesting. The Elector Frederick, in other words, the local ruler there, a man named Frederick. Wittenberg was a young town, and it had a young university, and the famous university was Leipzig. And Frederick wanted his university to be great, so he asked the Augustinians to send him some very bright young professors, and Martin Luther was one of those volunteers. There Luther came under a spiritual advisor who kept hearing all of these tormented confessions. And he said to him, but don't you believe in penance, and don't you believe in forgiveness, and so forth? Instead, he was just racked with doubts. In fact, a good example of doubts are to be seen when he began to celebrate his very first Mass. In fact, his father came, and Luther didn't perform too well. I think it would be well to let you know what he said. When he came to the Mass, which medieval Catholicism taught that the priest and only the priest had the power to transform the elements into the very body and blood of Christ. In other words, once you were qualified to say the Mass, you were qualified to come up to that table and do a miracle right in front of your eyes. Well, when Luther got up to that point, he said, with this, the words, we offer the true and living eternal God. With these words, I was utterly stupefied and terror-stricken. I thought to myself, with what tongue shall I address Majesty, seeing that all men ought to tremble in the presence of even an earthly prince? Who am I that I should lift up mine eyes or raise my hands to divine Majesty? The angels surround him. At his nod, the earth trembles. And shall I, a miserable little pygmy, say, I want this, I ask for that? For I am dust and ashes and full of sin, and I am speaking to the living, eternal, and true God. Here is a man, as John Osborne said, intoxicated with a sense of God's presence. Luther was so mortified, so humbled, so abased by going to that altar that he could hardly talk to his father, who had come and made a fine donation and brought his best horses, and still complained that Luther wasn't going to support him when he got old. That just became a kind of permanent problem with him. Well, now Luther carried all of these problems to his confessor. He tried mysticism, he tried penance, he tried everything possible, and none of this would work. He says, I was myself driven to the very abyss of despair, so that I wished I had never been created. Love God? I hated Him, because God was the source of a torment that he could not find peace. Well, his confessor, Staupitz, decided mysticism is not working, penance is not working, self-mortification is not working. So he says, what you need is more education. He suggested that Luther get a doctor's degree and become a teacher. Now you can probably see what he's saying. He's saying, you are worried about your internal problems too much. You need to start helping other people. So Luther got a doctor's degree, and he began to teach at Wittenberg in the university, and that becomes the center of his life for the rest of his life. In other words, he lives out his life in Wittenberg. Well, just at this point, as he begins to teach, the first course that he offers is a course in the Psalms, 1513. Now, you might think, well, the Psalms are sweet devotional literature. What does Luther become absolutely obsessed with? Psalm 22, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? That's all he can think about. How do you answer the sense of forsakenness? Then he began to lecture on Romans. And when he came to Romans 1:17, the just shall live by faith, he realized there is nothing man can do to answer the question of forsakenness. God is the only one that can supply the answer to the problems created by God. And it was in studying Romans that Luther wrote in the margin of his Latin Bible there, sola fide, only by faith, which of course was to become the watchword of the Reformation. But then he moved on over to Galatians, which was on law and gospel. And by the time Luther had thoroughly mastered as a scholar and had taught Psalms, Romans, and Galatians, he was ready with his theological foundation. Now, how did he apply it? Well, the problem was, and we saw this in Wycliffe, we see it even more in Luther. The problem was that the church was misbehaving. Leo X was trying to build the new present St. Peter's in Rome. That is some building. That's the most impressive church building you'll ever see. And it cost a huge amount of money. And the only place to get that money was from all of the countries in the Holy Roman Empire. And they needed more money than the tax revenues that the various groups had approved. And so the thing they were using was indulgences. Now, indulgences were a way in which people could pray their deceased relatives out of purgatory by a contribution. And a certain man named Tetzel was a magnificent hawker of indulgences. He went through the streets, and as he called, he says, listen to the voices of your dead dear relatives and friends beseeching you, saying, pity us, pity us. In other words, get us out of purgatory. And then his proposition was, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul of your friend from purgatory springs. In other words, put the money in, and out goes the friend from purgatory. Well, and they were really pushing it. In other words, this was medieval bingo. And they... Sorry about that. And what you need to realize was that this was not only taking the limited money of simple, humble peasants, money they couldn't afford. That was the individual tragedy. But at a bigger level, this was taking an enormous amount of money out of what is now Germany, and the civil rulers didn't like that. They were in what we would call a balance of payments deficit with the Vatican. They were sending all of their money to Rome, and they weren't getting anything back. And so as Luther began to attack this for theological reasons, the ruler, Frederick, was happy to support him for political reasons, because he didn't want this money leaving his realm. He wanted it used in commerce for prosperity. So the highlight of this finally was that Luther, now a professor, scholar, decided to write 95 theses. That just means a proposition. And in the form of that day, to print them up and to attach them to the castle door, or the door of the castle cathedral. In other words, the ruler's official place to worship in Wittenberg. It was October 31, 1517. That is as good an act as any to symbolize the birth of the Reformation. But unless we make it very dramatic. Now, if somebody were doing a movie on it, they would show Luther striding down the street with everybody falling back, waiting, watching, hushed, and wondering. That's not what he did at all. He was actually putting up an agenda for scholars to discuss, to debate in scholarly argumentation. He wasn't trying to influence the masses. He wasn't trying to start a revolution. He was willing to say, I'll defend these propositions. Here's an open invitation for somebody to take the other side. It was just an invitation to debate. But no sooner did he print them than they began to be reproduced like leaflets, pamphlets, and distributed across the countryside. They began to be read by everybody. And as Bainton puts it very interestingly in his letter, in his biography, Luther was like a man climbing in the darkness a winding staircase in the steeple of an ancient cathedral. In the darkness, he reached out to steady himself and laid hold of a rope. He was as startled as anybody to hear the clanging of the bell. That is, he had started more than he realized. Well, as this began to spread, basically, and I've got to, summarize and keep going here, Luther becomes the reformer. The thing I think you need to realize is that as soon as Rome got a hold of this, they sent for him. And Luther appealed to the local leaders to say, do you want Germans tried by Italians in Rome? Or do you want Germans tried by Germans in Germany? Now you can imagine what the ruler would say. And so the ruler had leverage on the Pope. Why? He's sending him all that tax money he needs. And so Frederick appeals to Charles V, the great ruler of the whole Holy Roman Empire, and says, let's tend to this locally. So Luther used very skillfully the local political leaders to keep from going to Rome to be called on the carpet by, quote, a bunch of Italians. And instead, there started a process that was at first a private interview with the Archbishop Cajetan, but eventually it led to a diet of worms. That's spelled worms, W-R-N-S, but the Germans don't call it that. Don't you call it that either. And most people don't understand the point. The diet, that term didn't mean they were on a diet. That was a term for an assembly, a congress, a parliament. And Worms was the name of a town. It just meant this was an assembly, and it was a political assembly of German nobility. Therefore, as Luther began to approach this, he began to appeal to German patriotism. And he began to say, I am only a servant of Scripture, but don't let these foreigners condemn me as a heretic. Well, they rushed into it, and this Cajetan got so mad that he sent back a report, and they started burning Luther's books. And that made Frederick mad. And he said, you started burning a German's books without even giving him a chance to defend himself. So finally the meeting was held. They debated both sides of it. And Luther basically took the position I cannot put anything above Scripture. I cannot put Pope. I cannot put Council. I cannot put Creed. And, of course, this becomes the very famous turning point that we often hear about. When they finally forced him to say, will you recant? He says, my conscience is captive to the Word of God. I cannot do otherwise. God help me. And here I stand. That's kind of the watchword. There's a little debate about all that Luther said right there. That's kind of the dramatic version, and he probably said most of that. And when he did, of course, the fat was in the fire. At this point, Luther, what did the council do? Well, when most of the people had left, the powers that be succeeded in getting Luther under edict. In other words, they banned him. They said, you're a heretical teacher. But when Luther left, Frederick gave him sanctuary in the castle at Wartburg. Now that meant he literally just hid out there. In fact, he hid under the bed. Luther had horrible insomnia. Once he went 5 days in which he could not close his eyes and go to sleep. 5 days. So he hid there. He called it my Patmos, my exile, my period of humiliation. He was absolutely a renegade running for his life. But what did he do? He used those 2 years, 1521-22, to translate the New Testament and then later the Old Testament, which is absolutely pivotal. It is as important to the German language as the King James Version is to the English language. In a sense, I'll have to ask my new expert in the German language I've got here, but it is in a sense the birth of modern German as culture and language. It set the tone and the style. It represented an almost dramatic move from medieval to modern. Luther, in that single blow, while he was hiding from his enemies, became profoundly influential. Clearly, he influenced German culture as much as Shakespeare influenced English culture, to give you a picture. Well, while he was away from Wittenberg, what he had started began to run amok. And I really got to hurry here. His colleagues that he had recruited, like Melanchthon and Karlstadt and others, began to marry. Now, nothing breaks down the Catholic priestly system like monks marrying nuns. Then they began to serve the wine to the layman. Now, you think, you have the Lord's Supper, you eat the bread, drink the cup. No. Prior to that time, they did not offer the wine because this was the miraculously transubstantiated blood of Christ, which the priest offered to God as sacrifice. But now they started offering it to lay people as communion, as fellowship. And they started banning icons, smashing images, saying that indulgences were wrong. And by the time Luther got back, he had a revolution on his hands that was almost going faster than he wanted. And you need to know that at this stage, Luther began to put on some brakes. The people called the Anabaptists, our forebears, the radical reformers, the right wing, the Thomas Münsters, even Zwingli down in Switzerland, Luther began to say, you're going too far, too fast. The peasants began to uprise. See, nationalism and religious reformation was going along. Luther didn't like the peasants' revolt. Luther basically was an aristocrat, even though he was a peasant aristocrat, or an earthy aristocrat, who didn't like things to be done revolutionary. He liked it to be done in order. He was a politician. He wanted things to be stable. And so he slowed down the Reformation, which is one of the reasons that a lot of the Catholicism passed over into Lutheranism. He wasn't saying, can we throw it all away? He was rather saying, can we preserve a continuity that nevertheless achieves stability? Well, at this point, Luther probably symbolically does the most important thing. He gets married himself to Catherine von Bora, thereby creating for the first time the Protestant parsonage. The last years of his life, the last 16 or so, from about 1530 till he died in 1546, were mainly years of incredible writing. Luther wrote voluminously. He preached voluminously. They did not, however, represent any new changes in his position. When he finally died, he was in terrible health all of this time. Had terrible indigestion, dyspepsia, all kind of things. Catherine helped all that. When he finally died, what had he done? He had clearly created Germany. See, there wasn't any Germany. There wasn't a separate culture and a separate religion. He bestrode the German reality like a colossus. He was a prince of the national mindset. He had also created Protestantism, which I interpret, I was going to talk 5 minutes, but just to hit this with a phrase. Luther made the church pay for its successes. That is, the church's willingness to become hokey, to become superstitious, to dabble in magic. Luther was the one that made them pay for it. Which is a way of saying if we do that today, somebody God will send to make us pay for it. But the last thing that he did, Luther internalized religion like nobody who ever lived. Here is where he was ahead even of Augustine. Because Augustine was the one who had to work with Cyprian and others to make Christianity part of the city of God. In other words, Augustine made us forever part of the corporate whole. But it was Luther who, in the same spirit, made religion an intensely individual matter of faith. Nobody has, even Paul, has never come as close to making religion as personal, as inward, as introspective, as existential as Martin Luther. Clearly the Catholic complaint is he put far too much weight on each individual to bear. So the real decision you have to face on Luther is, does my destiny before God stand on just what I decide? All of his detractors said, how could so many thousands of leaders have been wrong for so many hundreds and hundreds of years? The deepest issue of all was Luther finally pitted his heart against 1,000 years of establishment. And finally you have to decide whether that was arrogant or whether it was right.
This concludes Dr. Hall's sermon. We pray that its message has brought new insight to your life. If there is any way that Dr. Hall or our staff may be of Christian service to you, please do not hesitate to call or write us. We will give your inquiry a prompt, courteous, and confidential reply. Our address is First Baptist Church, 543 Ockley Drive, Shreveport, Louisiana, 71106. The telephone number is area code 318-865-8414.